It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Jeffrey Amestoy served as Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court from 1997 to 2004. Before that, he was Vermont's Attorney General, elected twice as a Republican and 5 times as the nominee of both the Republican and Democratic Party. As Chief Justice, Amestoy authored the landmark Baker decision in 1999, which held that same-sex couples were constitutionally entitled to the rights and benefits of marriage. The highly respected jurist is deeply concerned about the country these days. He says democracy is at risk under President Donald Trump, who he calls an autocrat. His concerns go beyond the view that the Republican Congress and conservative majority on the Supreme Court are enabling Trump. They go deeper than that. Amestoy thinks the public doesn't understand that even though the judiciary is a key part of the American system of checks and balances, there's little recourse if the president's loyalists control the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the military, and the president chooses to defy a court ruling, even one that might come from the U.S. Supreme Court. His second worry is about next year's congressional races. He says the president is making statements intended to undermine the public's faith in the integrity of elections, and Trump's deployment of the National Guard to some American cities could dampen voter turnout. The former Chief Justice also raised the specter of Trump attempting to stay in office after his term is over. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Cafe and Bakery, Amestoy outlines his concerns and the limited options available for the public to fight back. But his message about Trump's amassing of power is clear. Quote, "Don't look to any easy fix, either from a decision of the United States Supreme Court or an election result. I don't think we're in a world where those are the answers to what we're in right now," unquote. Our discussion begins in a moment. First, a word from our sponsor. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. You're former Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court, so I think you're in a unique position to be able to talk about this. As we have progressed here, we're now in month 8, I believe, of the Trump administration. How concerned are you about the judicial branch, one of the 3 branches of government, holding in check presidential power?
Well, I'm very concerned. If we put it on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm probably at a 9. And the reason is primarily because I think there is a misunderstanding of the extent to which judicial power can be exercised. That is, a misunderstanding of where the source of power for the adherence to the rule of law comes from. It doesn't come from judges. It comes from the democracy itself, from the people themselves. So I think if you have someone who's is going to refuse to obey a judicial order, there's very little a court can do about that. So my concern would be that this president has demonstrated that he will disregard judicial orders when it's in his interest to do so. And I think if he does, I think it's very difficult to see what courts could do about that. And that's even assuming that the United States Supreme Court issues an order that's directly contrary to what the president is interested in. And I think it's just naive to think, since President Trump has control of the Department of Justice, what he now calls the Department of War, and the FBI, that a court could enforce an order. So I think that's really my concern. It's more that than it is about the judicial rulings. Eventually there may be a ruling that calls into question from the United States Supreme Court that calls into question Trump's extra-constitutional maneuvers, but I don't see how that's going to be enforced. So that's my concern.
Well, there have already been, from what I've read, 60 or 70 rulings by lower court judges below the Supreme Court that have effectively filed, they've put in an injunction to stop something that Trump wants to do. But then they go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in essence, undoes that.
Well, yeah, I think that'd be part of my concern is some of the rulings of the court in terms of its, particularly the so-called the shadow docket, that is, making rulings on injunctions without full opinions that at least 3 members of the court have consistently objected to. And there's reasons to object to that. But I think my concern is it's more about which cases the court is willing to take and what cases are coming to the court. I mean, if you look at the docket coming up, the tariff case, there's the tariff case, then there's the case on whether Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve Board can be removed. But we haven't seen the court willing to take on a fast track the Alien and Sedition Act, or the number of the cases that raise all the most significant questions about whether democracy will survive are still in the lower courts, based on the court saying, well, the injunction is not appropriate this time, and is sending it back to the lower courts for further findings. So the court is not moving in a way that you would hope it would move. They may move more quickly on the citizenship question, but that's only because the Trump administration has asked for that. They've asked for a faster docket on that, so that may be argued in this term. But if you look at the scheduled term that begins in October and ends in June for the United States Supreme Court, where are the cases that we all should be concerned about that go directly to the issue of the ability of courts to maintain the rule of law? I don't see those, and so that's a concern for sure.
When the Supreme Court lifts the injunction, in effect, they're allowing the administration to go forward with what they originally have sought. Is that typical?
Well, I think it really does go on a case-by-case basis. I think one of my great reservations about how this is all playing out is I just think judicial rulings, even from the Supreme Court, and even on injunctions and on the shadow docket, all the rest, though you can explain and defend each of those on an individual basis. But I think the court I'm talking about the Supreme Court now, is naive in that it's not seeing the pattern here. And Donald Trump is not the brain behind all this, but I can tell you, I'm extraordinarily impressed, unfortunately, with the quality of the strategic sense of folks working for Trump on picking and choosing the cases and getting them in a way that they keep the real issues out of the United States Supreme Court, and then they frame issues that come to the Supreme Court that they have an excellent chance of winning on. And I just think the difficulty with all that is that if you do not step back and take a look at that, then you're going to have what is already happening, this extraordinarily incremental series of decisions which lead up to one big conclusion, which Trump draws from it. Of course, I have the absolute authority to do what I want, and I think that's the real danger.
When you say that you think the Supreme Court is being naive, I mean, really? These are smart people.
Well, I think it's naive in I'm using it in the sense of my understanding. I don't pretend to be smarter than people in the United States Supreme Court, of course, but I do think you need a fundamental appreciation of the way where power comes from in a democracy. And one of the ways you get that actually is if you run for office. I know judges who think they've been dropped from the sky in their robes, but I always thought the power of the law and the Supreme Court, where it comes from the guy I met campaigning at the Rutland Fair. That's where it comes from. So once those folks, I mean, the people that make up a democracy, have lost faith in the rule of law, or are been led to believe that the rule of law doesn't make any difference, then that's the authority of the court disappears. And so that's the sense in which I'm saying I think the court is. I don't think they have a full appreciation for where the authority is. Earl Warren and other people have pointed this out. Earl Warren was he was elected Attorney General of California and elected Governor of California. He was a great Chief Justice. Brown versus Board of Education, his famous decision, not no one, but that case was not a brilliant legal analysis, but he understood better than those who would have analyzed it totally in terms of precedent and equal protection and all the rest. Warren understood the significance of trying to make a democracy work, even when sometimes you had to take a look at the law and say, well, I don't find precedent here, but we're going to make some. I don't think that this court, which has no member of the current Supreme Court was ever an elected official. I think the last one was, and it's one of the reasons I think she was a great or a very sensible justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. She'd spent time in the Arizona legislature. She knew something about how it all works, and I think that's the disconnect I see between this court and what's going on.
That's interesting. I hadn't noticed that. The court is generally described as being 6-3 conservative versus liberal. So when you look at these decisions they're making, or the non-decisions that they're making, or even putting off decisions, it looks to the average person like me that it's very partisan. Does it look the same way to you?
Well, I don't see it. I can understand why it looks that way, and I think both parties, the Democrat and Republican parties, and deserve or not deserve. The blame is equally on our political system and both parties, who turned the confirmation of Supreme Court justices into political partisan contests. So it's certainly understandable how you would look that way. There's no question that if you're a president who's conservative, you get to appoint justices that are more in line with your conservative views. The same if it's a liberal president, you get to do that. That's always been part of our system. But one of the reasons, I think, for the difficulty Americans have in believing that it's anything other than politics, partisan politics, is that it's been the confirmation process and then the political process that gets to get votes from blaming decisions on courts or attacking courts. That's all made this an extraordinarily partisan prism to which people use to look at the Supreme Court. So, and that's part of the difficulty, I think, it's one of the reasons, of course, I think that's why the Supreme Court's decision, if we get to a point where they have say to President Trump, no, this is unconstitutional, I think, President Trump understands better than anyone else what button is to push on that. And they're all partisan. He's just going to say what he's said all along. It's a partisan court, it's a Democratic court, or whatever the ruling is, or he'll attack, he'll have to attack Chief Justice Roberts, whoever else comes down with a decision that's against him, but he'll do that in the kinds of rhetoric that has worked for him before in attacking other institutions.
These lower court rulings that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that legal observers, and I'm sure you've noticed this too, is that unlike in the first Trump administration, where the pushback was coming from Democratic appointed judges, now almost, if not half of these decisions that are being pushed back on are by Republican appointed judges. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me, and it should tell anybody that's paying attention, that the actions being taken by this administration are extrajudicial, blatantly unconstitutional in many instances. And so that, it's not a surprise to me that judges with integrity and federal judges, generally, the integrity is not the problem. The problem is whether you're going to get people to obey the rule of law when it's necessary. But it's not a surprise to me at all that judges now are looking at actions taken by the administration that they find abhorrent, and that would be true no matter what your political background or who your appointment was. So yeah, you're right. I mean, if you look at some of the strongest criticisms from lower court judges has come from judges appointed either by Trump or Bush, but appointed by Republicans. So I think that's very telling in terms of how dire the situation is in terms of the willingness of Trump administration to push the outer bounds of the law.
Expanding executive power.
Right.
Can you give me an example or two of the ones that really stand out for you that Republicans have pushed back on, Republican judges have pushed back on that were significant?
Well, I think there's a district court judge out of there have been so many of them in terms of individual decisions by district court judges, federal judges basically at the trial level. But I think there was a decision out of I believe it was out of the District of Massachusetts, where the court just emphasized the extent to which the Trump administration had just disregarded the law and in front of the court would make representations that were not only contrary to the record. They would either not answer the question, they would claim, for example, in the removing immigrants, they would claim we'd represent to the court that we don't have information or that, or I don't know, or I can't find out. And I think so. You had judges just calling the Department of Justice lawyers to task for that in ways that it's really unusual. And misrepresentations to the court are extraordinarily unusual by the Department of Justice. I mean, I think anyone who knows the Department of Justice in terms of its career attorneys and all the rest, the fact to have somebody go into a federal court from the Department of Justice as an assistant U.S. attorney or other member and misrepresent to a federal court some fact is extraordinary. And I think you've had judges push back on that have been Republican judges who just say, this is not the way it's done.
But then the Supreme Court not maintaining those injunctions, does that or does it not indicate that, does that concern you?
Well, I think the disconnect between the Supreme Court and what we're seeing at the lower federal court level is the disconnect is that the Supreme Court is not grappling with the issues that the lower courts are, and they're avoiding that by saying, well, we're going to remove this injunction, we're going to send it back for further findings, or we want you to take a look at this in another way, and that prevents those kinds of cases from getting to the Supreme Court as quickly as one would hope. And I think that's, as I indicated, I just think that's an open invitation to a continuing effort by the executive to push the very outer limits of executive power, and that's what's going on. I think the Supreme Court is, I've said naive, but they're just, I believe they're continuing to ignore the extent to which this just feeds into the president's sense of invincibility, and it's not it's understandable why he thinks he's invincible. I think because he hasn't been called to account, and in my judgment, he's not going to be called to account by a court. He's going to be called to account by the American people, or he's not.
Well, that's a kind of breathtaking statement. So you think he would even ignore Supreme Court rulings?
Oh, yeah, I don't. My question would be, on what evidence? What evidence can you present to me that would demonstrate that Donald Trump would obey a Supreme Court decision that was contrary to his interest? I don't think he'll obey an election result that's contrary to his interest, and I don't think he would obey a court order that's contrary to his interest.
That sounds to me, sixth grade history, a basic failure of democracy. If one branch of government he's already ignored many of congressional request. But I mean, for him to defy Supreme Court orders strikes me as a complete failure of the three-legged stool of democracy.
Well, I think it is, and I think Garrett Graff, I think, has talked about a constitutional crash instead of a constitutional crisis, and I think that's the right way to frame the issue. I think, that doesn't. Again, the courts are only as strong as the public's belief in the courts, and only as strong as the willingness of the executive branch and the legislative branch to enforce or stand by those decisions. So, I get back to, if I were interested in being king of America, the first thing I would do is what Donald Trump did. I would make sure I had somebody at the Department of Justice, the Attorney General. I would make somebody head of the FBI and a Secretary of Defense, now Secretary of War, that would do my bidding under any circumstances. And I think he does. I don't think there's any reason to think that any one of those three individuals, to the extent they have control of their departments, in which they obviously do at this point because they're pushing a lot of people out, will stand up to Donald Trump and say, Mr. President, you're going to have to obey this order. That's all there is to it. And if you don't, the Department of Justice is going to take steps, or the FBI is going to take steps. I mean, who listening to this would think that Attorney General Bondi or Pete Hegseth or the FBI director would stand up to Donald Trump?
But let's go back to the Supreme Court. When you say, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, when you say that Donald Trump is creeping further and further towards authoritarianism and the Supreme Court is doing nothing to stop that, that's I don't even know what the word is. What's the word that you would use to describe that? I would maybe say heartbreaking.
Well, yeah, I mean, heartbreaking is as good as any other word, I suppose. It's tragic, I think. I mean, it's the direction of the country in terms of all those issues. I mean, I think it's very difficult to look at the sequence over the last 8 months and not be very, very concerned. So, we're not at the end of the story. There's lots of, not lots, but, the ending is not written. But I think there's, real reasons to be concerned that we're in a situation that it's very difficult to see how one ends the tenure of someone who is willing to use executive authority in a way that makes it incredibly difficult to stand up to him. And I think that's what's happening. So,
why do you think the Supreme Court, and I guess in particular, you've been a Chief Justice, why is Chief Justice Roberts allowing this slow, incremental expansion of presidential power and not having the court take on some of these cases, not uphold some of these nationwide injunctions?
Well, I think it's because he's looking at these decisions incrementally in a way that's orderly and consistent with how he would do it in normal times. And so I think I don't think my own view is that he doesn't appreciate the risk to the rule of law, and I think that's the reason why, it's going to be very difficult, I think. Chief Justice Roberts believes in the rule of law. There may come a time when he's going to have to speak very directly to why it should be obeyed. But in my own judgment, that should have come much, much earlier, and I think it's going to be very more difficult to do it, later. So I think again, it's not because the integrity, or not because I don't believe John Roberts is, and I don't. My guess is he would not be a great supporter of Donald Trump in the privacy of his own home, but I do think he's underestimated the extent to which you can put the genie back in the bottle, if you will, after it's out.
You and I had a conversation earlier where you said that you thought John Roberts should address the nation.
Yeah, I phrased it that way, and I thought, I'm not so sure that's probably that might not have been the right forum, but the point is the same. I think John Roberts, I think a Chief Justice is a leader of democracy, not just a leader of a judicial branch. And I think there are times, and I think we're into one of them, when it's really important as a leader of democracy that you speak to people in the democracy about the significance of the rule of law, and do it in a way that makes it clear as you can, that there are consequences to be paid if the rule of law is avoided. And I think he could have done that earlier. He's made some statements, but ordinarily sitting at Georgetown Law School or saying judges shouldn't be impeached or the rule of law should be followed. I think his mistake was not to say 2 months into the Trump presidency, when it's very clear the extent to which this president is going to push the envelope, to begin with a strong statement on the necessity of the administration following the rule of law, and to reemphasize that every place he could. And he could do that. It wouldn't have to be a national speech, I suppose, but he could certainly do that in a way that makes it much more obvious the extent to which he's concerned about that. And I'm sure he is concerned about it, but you don't get, to me, that's the dilemma, and that's my misgiving about the court, much more so than people say, well, this court's partisan and not fair. It's not that. It's just it is that they are underestimating and minimizing the extent to which this president is unlike any other president.
But and I don't want to be repetitive, but how is that possible that you could have 9 highly educated judicial minds underestimating this?
Well, I think that question misunderstands the role of the judiciary, right? I mean, so you don't have it's like how could you have there's smart people in the Congress and in the U.S. Senate, smart people in the Republican Party that voted to confirm Trump's nominees for Attorney General, FBI, and Secretary of Defense, all of whom knew that every one of those people didn't have the character to hold those positions. I'm talking about the Congress now, the Senate. They had the responsibility and the authority to directly intervene in those cases by saying, well, no, we're not going to confirm someone like that. The court doesn't get to say, we're just going to take a step back here and say we're just going to issue a blanket statement that that this administration is not following the rule of law, and we're going to put an end to it. I mean, they have to take the cases on a case-by-case basis. But again, I think the 3 justices that have continued, for example, to dissent to the shadow docket are trying to say to the Chief Justice, listen, this is a different animal here, and we need to say things in a different way. And I think that's correct. But I don't think so. It's not a matter of that they haven't. So that's how I'd respond to that question. I just think it's and I do think it's a mistake. I mean, my message would be: don't think that courts will save you. I mean, I think when we talked before, I talked about Leonard Hand, who is the greatest judge never to serve on the United States Supreme Court. So in 1944, he gave a famous speech where war was still going on. It was actually the swearing in of immigrants, and in which he said, when the spirit of liberty dies, courts cannot save it. They cannot even do much to help it. And he used the phrase "spirit of liberty." And I was just going back and looked at Calvin Coolidge's "Brave Little State" speech, and he uses the same phrase, "spirit of liberty," saying that if it dies in parts of the country, it can be replenished from the brave little state of Vermont. And I think both Coolidge and Hand understood that that's where the authority of the court comes from. It comes from the spirit of liberty. I mean, on the most basic level, the question is, how do you enforce court order if without without the authority to do it. I mean, you have you can say you have the legal authority, but the U.S. Marshals don't work for the court. The Department of Justice has shown no signs that it's willing to take this president on, and I think those are all reasons why I put my concern at a very high level.
You mentioned Congress, and I would agree with you, and I think many Americans would agree that they haven't stepped up and said, for example, no, we have the power to decide where money is spent. Right. We have the power to decide if tariffs are imposed. But I think the difference is that members of Congress have to run for re-election. And I think their hesitancy may be that they may be primaried by a more conservative person. That is not the case with people on the Supreme Court who have a lifetime appointment.
Right, but I don't think you get points for. Saying, well, you understand that I can't stand up for a principle because I have to run for office.
I'm not justifying, but I'm saying, to make them equivalent, with all due respect, the Supreme Court doesn't have that threat to them, so that the idea of them not standing up to this incremental move towards authoritarianism seems more cowardly than somebody in Congress.
Well, I think it actually leads to I think it actually re-emphasizes my point. Is that they don't see this. I'm talking to the members of the court. They don't see this in that light. So they're incrementally deciding cases in a way that's consistent with legal analysis, and that's most of the. I mean, leaving aside the injunction shadow sub, which I think again represents just a bad judgment in terms of that, and Roberts, I think, a court that doesn't want to grapple with the most basic issues. But again, it's the incremental decision making of the court that I think is the reason for members of the court not taking it, if it's a risk. I think that doesn't. My point is, it doesn't have anything to do with they're not sitting there and say, well, we're tenured, so it doesn't make any difference what we we don't have anything to lose. I think that's that's an overly simplistic way of looking at it. Again, I get back to my point that my concern would be that it's just from my own view. I think folks that are most concerned about President Trump, have an unrealistic expectation that this is going to be solved by the judicial system. It's just not, and it's not going to be solved by the United States Supreme Court. And my fear is that that's exactly what will happen. And I think, I hope I'm wrong, but I just don't see Donald Trump obeying an order of the United States Supreme Court that's adverse to his interests.
Has that ever happened?
No, I don't think it's ever happened. Of course not.
Okay, well, help me understand. What happens if he defies that order? What is the likely scenario?
Well, you tell me. I mean, I don't. Anybody.
You're a lot smarter than I am, so you tell me.
No, I think if you play that out, the question of whether the American people are going to say, well, we just think that's a step too far. We call upon our Congress to take steps. Congress reacts and say, yes, we agree. We finally see the light. We're going to impeach the president, or we're going to, so the steps that ordinarily would take place are ones I think have been delegitimized already, or at least in the minds of many folks. We've already gone through 2 impeachments of President Trump, and I just think that's the difficulty of seeing what the end game is, in the sense of how you make someone who has the power. Remember now, he has the executive power is not just a phrase, right? Executive power means someone who has control of the military, the Department of Justice, the FBI. So those are real instruments of power. The question is, does one believe that President Trump, confronted with a decision of the United States Supreme Court that would limit his authority or otherwise curtail what he wanted to do, does one believe that he would obey that instantaneously? I think that's naive to believe that. And I think if push comes to shove, how do you determine how to make the president comply? It's certainly not by taking him to court.
Well, you have indicated you think that he will defy a Supreme Court order that he doesn't agree with. I mean, realistically, where do you see this going? I mean, you're going to go, I hope I'm not talking out of school here. You're going and visiting your family. You have a grandchild. Where do you see this going?
Well, I mean, again, I don't see that. I can't predict where it goes. I just think my concern is, and my expression of concern, I guess, would be really on 2 points. We haven't even gotten to the second. The first would be, as I've indicated, I just think it's misguided to think that a decision of even the United States Supreme Court is going to make a difference in the trajectory of this president's continuing effort to expand his authority. He's an authoritarian figure. He models himself on authoritarian figures. He's very good at what he does. I think it's very unlikely that he would wake up one morning and say, I've really underestimated the rule of law. I'm mistaken in my criticisms of the rule of law. I now understand that the rule of law should be followed. I mean, that's just not going to happen. And I think it's also true of elections. I don't think there's any reason to believe he would abide by an election result that is contrary to his interest either. And I think he's demonstrated that. I mean, I go back to January 6th. He would not accept results of a presidential election when he was president of the United States, but then he didn't have the authority in the sense of having his own people at the FBI and the own people at the Department of Justice and all the rest. So he couldn't, he of course tried to. He tried to overthrow the results of the election. So I don't understand why people would think that he would react any differently if in 2026, for example, there's an election result he didn't like. So I don't think it's difficult to see the immediate risk here. But how it all ends, I don't know. But I mean, I guess I'd go back to Coolidge's quote and say, well, you hope the spirit of liberty is here, and you can draw it from Vermont, and others do draw it from Vermont.
So your first concern is that the judiciary, the message to the American public is the judiciary, the Supreme Court, is not going to save the republic.
That's right. The people that are going to save the republic are the people who live in the republic, right? I mean, I go back to my initial statement here that the authority of the courts and the rule of law comes from democracy, the people that live in democracy. That's where the authority is. And if you reach a point where the rule of law is not believed in by by folks who live in democracy, then that's the spirit of liberty that's at risk, and that's what Leonard Dan talked about. When it dies in the hearts of men and women, a court can't save it and can't do much to help it. And I just think that's this idea that the court system is going to settle everything. I thought it was misguided in the prosecutions against Trump that if only we could convict President Trump, that would solve things. I don't think I thought that was a mistake from the start. It just makes him stronger and allows him to politicize in a way that's extraordinarily helpful to him to say, look, all these prosecutions are political. This is Democrat versus Republican. We all understand the rule of law is something that can be used when it's in your favor and something that can be denied when it's not in your favor. I think that's his mindset.
How can the American public save democracy when the administration has the power to round up people that are here legally, to send troops into cities and communities with the National Guard? How concerned are you that the American public won't have that ability to push back and try to save democracy?
Well, the concern is, I think it's difficult. I'm not the only one who's looked at this and tried to understand or what levers are left, and beyond just a rejection that's apparent from whether it's millions of people demonstrating against the president or an economic collapse that puts it all beside the point. It's difficult to see what other steps could curtail the trajectory of the president. And I think it's not an accident. Again, you look at the executive orders that the president has signed relating to the integrity of elections, as well as his efforts to place National Guard units in various cities. I mean, those are all, I think, steps that are being taken to ensure that the 2026 election will not be one where you can trust the results. And I think the waters will be muddied in advance of those elections in a way that makes it extraordinarily difficult for folks to accept the results. And Trump, I think that's part of the plan. I think the other piece of that is the National Guard in Chicago. As you said, I'm going to Chicago. I have family in Chicago. In Chicago, in most parts of Chicago, it looks fine. There's not a problem. In the places where their National Guard and mostly ICE agents are pushing it, I think they're trying to precipitate an incident that will then lead to, riots or the kinds of civil disturbances that allow Trump then to say, "See, I told you this was going to happen." And I think that's another risk. And I just think it's obvious that the administration here would welcome any opportunity to expand a claim to be able to use military force. And again, in Vermont, I'm not the only Vermonter speaking against this. You have a Secretary of State who's already said she's extraordinarily concerned about elections, even in Vermont, where there could be troops at polling places just who, by their own presence, deter folks from voting. And you have the governor, and this is certainly nonpartisan. Governor Scott saying this use of National Guard is unconstitutional. The last insurrection we had was January 6th. Again, I just think those are all. I think it's easy enough to see what the risks are. It's difficult, as you say, to come up with an answer to that other than continue to express concern. And that's obviously what I and others have been doing. And my message would be, don't look to an easy fix either from a decision of the United States Supreme Court or an election result. I don't think we're in a world where those are the answers to what we're in right now.
Did you ever think in your lifetime that you would be making that statement?
No.
Tell me more about that.
Well, I just think, again, President Trump is a different actor than we've ever had before. And I think we've had very flawed presidents, obviously. But the difference is, I think President Trump models himself on autocratic figures. I think he believes he's probably in his own life, he has nothing to demonstrate to him otherwise, that he alone can solve the problems he sees, and that those that are in his way are not part of the process. I mean, he doesn't see himself as an actor in a democratic society, I don't think. I mean, I think he sees himself as someone who can respond to the issues of the times in a way that can only be solved through the use of autocratic power. And he thinks, I have it, and I'll use it. And I think that's the difference. I think we've never had a president who's thought that way.
Do you see any possibility that he would try to extend his presidency past 2028?
Well, I guess I don't see. He doesn't strike me as someone who that likes to voluntarily surrender authority. And I guess if you ask, well, why do you say that? And I go, well, look at January 6th. There's extraordinary. Just the one, I think you have to read these executive orders that come out of the presidency, right? There's the executive order. Let's see, I wanted to make sure I quoted this correctly here. So they issued of the many executive orders that Trump has issued, there's one that deals with Chris Krebs, who was the director of the cybersecurity agency, and he was a appointment. He was a Trump appointee, and as folks may not remember, but in the run up to the election in 2020, the question became, was it an honest election? And Krebs, who was the director of cybersecurity, could say, because they had the tools to look at it, that yes, it was an honest election. We can look at the security of the cyber system, the voting system, and all the rest. We know it's an honest election. So Trump issues a executive order that targets Christopher Krebs, and part of that says that Christopher Krebs knew and falsely denied that the election was rigged and stolen, and did so by dismissing serious vulnerabilities with voting machines. So, and that executive order asked the Attorney General and Homeland Security, Secretary of Homeland Security, to issue a report which they will do, that will find that that's true, that the election of 2020 was stolen and rigged, and I think that's an indicator of how unlikely it is for that you have a president that would abide by elections that undermine his authority. And I think it's equally it was equal to the unlikelihood that he would accept a judicial opinion that undermined his authority.
I have two more brief questions. Fill in the blank here for me. Trump is
an autocrat.
Democracy is
at risk.
Those are extraordinary statements. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm not the only one that.
I mean, you're not an alarmist. You're a sober person who served as Attorney General in this state for many years. You served as the Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court. Those are two extraordinary statements you just made.
Well, again, I make those statements without knowing if they're right, but they're my best judgment based on my own experience and what I think is happening. And again, I would say I'm not the only one who has thought about this and are making these statements. And so, again, my message would just be to those who believe that there's a simple answer to this through an election or through a judicial opinion. I just think you're underestimating the degree of difficulty, if you will, and that That's a sobering message, I understand, but it's one that I think we have to come to grips with, and I think how we come to grips with it is an answer that many of us are searching for. But to the extent that folks haven't thought seriously about that, I guess my message is be thinking about it here, but don't look to the courts to save you.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.